Okay, let's talk about Kant. Now, I am not especially comfortable talking about Kant, partly because Kant is one of those philosophers who has kind of fanatical supporters. People who are Kantians tend to go all the way and regard Kant as the best thing since sliced bread. In fact, Kant, if you do a poll amongst philosophers of who's the greatest philosopher ever, it usually comes down to Aristotle or Kant. I'm not sure how deserved this is. Kant certainly was a giant of philosophy. And I think one of the things that sets him apart is he was kind of on his own for the period he was writing in. The period that Hume wrote in, there were a lot of people, for example, Hume and Rousseau, and Descartes had Hobbes at the same time, and several other great philosophers to converse with. But Kant was kind of off on his own, and he didn't have equals really to correspond with and to argue with. And that might kind of explain why his theory is sort of its own thing. It's certainly unique and certainly a very great theory, but also in many respects dense and impenetrable. If you are forced to read Kant's metaphysics, well, I pity you, because it's heavy going. What Kant is most famous for outside of philosophy, and inside it too probably, is his ethical theory. As I said, his metaphysical theory is regarded as great, but it is pretty heavy going, whereas his ethical theory is certainly a lot more influential and easier in some respects to get a grasp on. It's taught in introductory ethics classes as one of the great moral theories. You know, there tend to be at most three of these, so to be one of them and to be the only one that is sort of associated with a single figure shows you how great Kant was. Yeah, the three great ethical theories that tend to get taught in intro to ethics classes are Utilitarianism, that you should know about, that I've talked about, which is associated with Bentham and John Stuart Mill, whom we're going to read shortly, although not his Utilitarianism, which is a consequentialist theory. That is, it says that if we're judging whether or not an action or a policy is the right one, we look at its consequences and what it is likely to bring about. So if a policy, and specifically what matters is some interpretation of happiness. For Bentham, this was just pleasure. So Bentham had what he called a hedonic calculus. That was you had this sort of mathematical algorithm for working out the likelihood and distance and intensity of the pleasure that an action would cause for all affected, and the one that got the best results according to this calculus amongst your choices of actions would be the correct one. Now this is very down to earth, which was the point of it. It says it explains morality, which is kind of this nebulous notion, in terms of something that we all understand, which is pleasure, a simple raw feeling. But it has notorious criticisms because it seems to be willing to sacrifice the individual for the whole, because, you know, suppose it causes general happiness for me to kill you. Maybe you said something bad on Twitter and now everybody's piling on you, and I say I'll kill this person and this makes everybody happy. Then it seems like killing you is the right thing to do. In fact, I am morally compelled to kill you because of the happiness it will bring about. Of course, this isn't really something that you can endorse, but your happiness is outweighed by the many. But anyway, utilitarianism is the usual example of a consequentialist theory that you look at. Kant's theory is what tends to be called deontological or duty-based or rule-based. And unlike utilitarianism or consequentialist theories, it says that if an action is right, it's right in all circumstances. And if it's wrong in all circumstances. So if killing is wrong, then killing you is wrong, even though it would make everybody happy. And Kant had various formula for working out whether or not something was our duty to perform. And his principle he calls the categorical imperative. Notoriously, he gives 3 different formulations of the categorical imperative, which he claims all produce the same result, but most commentators aren't so sure about that. The first of these is that act so that you could will the maxim of your action to become a universal law. The idea behind this is simple enough. It's that morality is not is general. Morality must be general. It must apply the same to everybody. So in other words, if embezzling is wrong, it's wrong for me as much as everybody else. If selling your stock when you've just heard that the coronavirus is going to tank the stock market is wrong, then selling your stock in similar circumstances is wrong for everyone. That's the first formulation. The second formulation says act so that you respect in all persons their humanity, where their humanity involves their free will. I'm mangling that version of it, but the basic idea is that we owe respect to all free persons, which for Kant is humans, and respecting free persons requires treating them as an ends only, and not treating them as a means only. So in other words, you shouldn't treat humans as things. I can use my cup. My attitude towards my cup is solely, what can you do for me, cup? You are a means to my end, which is getting liquids to my mouth. But you cannot take this attitude towards humans because they are not things. They have free will. You must respect that they have choices and they are capable of making choice, and you cannot use them as objects. Lying is usually used to illustrate how the first 2 formulations of the categorical imperative give the same results. So you can't lie according to Kant, because if everybody lied, society wouldn't make sense. It's just sort of a self-contradictory. That is, if I lie every time I want to get my way, and I know that you won't give me what I want if I tell the truth, so I lie to manipulate you, doing that in all circumstances will mean that nobody will believe me, so lying is in some sense self-contradictory. It cannot be universalized. And because it cannot be universalized, that means it is always wrong. Even if I can get away with it, it's still wrong. And notoriously, Kant gives an example of a murderer coming to your door and asking where your friend is, and says you're not even allowed to lie in those circumstances. Or a more modern example that various writers have given is fishermen used to ferry Jewish families from Holland, which was occupied by the Nazis, over to England, which wasn't. But Nazi patrol boats used to catch them and ask them, have you got any passengers aboard? And utilitarians say, of course they should lie. That is the morally right thing to do in those circumstances, is to say, no, we haven't, because you're saving the lives of these people. But Kant would say, even in those circumstances, it is not morally right to lie. Now, again, this you can always make a moral theory sound stupid, and in many respects, Kant's theory gives much better results than utilitarianism. For example, it wouldn't allow us to sacrifice the one person for the happiness of the many. And Kantians tend to be pretty fanatical about their support of Kant. The other thing that Kant says is that your action only has moral worth if your motivation for it was purely out of a sense of duty. And it is this aspect of his theory that Garve, in the first section of the article that you read on the common saying, this may be true in theory, but it does not apply in practice, Garve is criticizing Kant, and Kant is responding to Garve's criticism of this. This is the main point on which they disagree. Garve says that Kant does not allow happiness to be a motivator for action, and that because we humans are in fact only motivated by our own happiness, this is why his theory, Kant's theory, is just a theory and wouldn't work in practice. So this is an instance of this may be true in theory but does not apply in practice being used against Kant. So Kant, in this whole essay, wants to show how his theory actually does work in practice and can produce practical results, and he applies it in three different spheres. In the first, in which he responds to Garve's criticism, is about his moral theory. The second is the one that is of most interest to us in this class, because it's his political theory, that is, one's stand as a statesman. Yeah, he says there are, I shall divide up this essay in terms of 3 points of view. The first point of view is the man of affairs, or the private individual. That's where he's disagreeing with Garve. And the sphere is morality. That's the area in which they have disagreement, where he has to argue that in fact his theory is perfectly practical. The second, where he claims to be criticizing Hobbes. Now, of course, Hobbes and Kant do not overlap in their lifespan. Hobbes was long dead at this point. So it's not like Hobbes has criticized Kant's theory, and it's not actually as if Kant spends all that much time talking about Hobbes. It's largely on one key point that Kant and Hobbes disagree, and that is on whether or not citizens have inalienable rights against their government. Where Kant appears to agree, Hobbes does say that a citizenry has a right to rebel against its sovereign when the sovereign is no longer able to protect the citizenry, because the whole point of setting up government for Hobbes is to escape the state of nature and the horrible situation of the state of nature. So the reason why individuals are motivated to form a government is because the government can enforce laws and keep us from falling back into the state of nature. And when a government is no longer able to do that, then of course you can overthrow it. That Hobbes does say that. But in general, Hobbes and Kant agree that the sovereign is pretty much above the law and cannot be prosecuted. So Hobbes and Kant agree on that point, and in fact Kant is completely against the right of rebellion. He says citizens just do not have the right to rebel. So he's very much opposed to what Locke appears to be advocating. Locke, while he takes pains to say that it very rarely comes up, certainly allows that citizenry may rebel against its leadership. That's what the whole last chapter of the Second Treatise of Government talks about. Whereas Kant says, no rebellion is allowed. So he's very strict on that. But he wants to make it clear that just because you can't rebel against the government, that doesn't mean that you don't have inalienable rights against the government. And in fact, he lists several. The most important, or the one that he picks out from the bunch, is the freedom of the pen. So in other words, unlike what Hobbes says. Hobbes, if you remember, says that the sovereign may censor writings that they judge to be seditious, and it's entirely up to the government to decide what counts as seditious. Kant says, no, you have freedom of the pen, freedom of speech and writing. And this is important to him, as we shall see. So, to the extent that Kant is disagreeing with Hobbes, it's in insisting, as, for example, the United States Constitution insists in the Bill of Rights, that there are certain rights that are inalienable and that no government can infringe upon. Whereas Hobbes doesn't allow that. Hobbes doesn't think, of course, that there are such things as natural rights that pre-exist the state. Basically, anything we've got, including our right to property, we have only as a result of the state existing. So, obviously, the state has control as to their scope, whereas Kant does not believe that. Kant believes that we have certain rights that are, in a sense, pre-political, although the most important innovation that people come back to this essay, it's because of this innovation that people cite this essay the most, is this claim by Kant that the social contract is merely an idea of reason. And we'll talk about that. It's not to be taken literally that there ever was a moment at which founders got together to found a body politic, or there's no such thing as actual consent to become a citizen. So neither founding consent nor joining consent, to use Lockean terminology, should be regarded as real. So in this respect, this is why I paired it with Hume. This is why I paired this essay of Kant's with Hume, because we've seen in Hume a devastating critique of the idea of the social contract as it appears to be found, certainly in Locke and probably in Rousseau too. Although Rousseau is occasionally given a hypothetical contract reading, and I'll explain more what I mean by hypothetical contract in a bit. So as we saw, this idea of using consent or promises as a grounding for political obligation, Hume rejected devastatingly for several reasons, both empirical/historical, and also philosophical. The philosophical part being that both keeping promises and being obligated to one's government are on the same level of duties, and they both are in need of justification. So you can't justify one, the obligation to one's government, in terms of the other, the duty to keep one's promises. Kant will revive the social contract against this critique by saying that the social contract is not to be taken literally. Now, this approach does have its own problems too. Certainly because the appeal of the Lockean contract is I can only be bound to I can only be obligated to my government if I personally have actually agreed to it. Hypothetical consent does not bind. So insofar as the Lockean social contract is also supposed to give a consent theory of political obligation, it cannot be replaced by a hypothetical contract. But in fact, what Kant sees as the role of the social contract is different from what Locke uses it for. He uses it as a test of legitimacy. And we'll get into that in a second. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the first and third sections, and then spend the most time talking about the middle section, because that's the middle section where Kant claims to be talking about or responding to Hobbes. And the middle section is the political sphere, where the point of view is the statesman, and that is where he talks about the social contract. So we've already talked about the first section is his response to a contemporary of his who has actually criticized him, this Garver, whose first name was Christian. And basically, very briefly, Kant implies that Garver has just misinterpreted him. Kant doesn't say, as actually a lot of people say of him now, that if you are motivated, but if happiness at all is any part in your motivation, that you are not acting morally. What he does say is that a sense of duty can motivate you. Now, this is something that Hume, for example, and many British philosophers have said since Hume. Hume famously said, reason is the slave of the passions, by which he meant that only your emotions ever drive you to do anything, and specifically pursuit of pleasure or avoidance of pain or something like that. Those are the only things that act as drives to your behavior. So the fact that your reason tells you something is the right thing to do will not motivate you by itself. The only thing that will motivate you is whether or not you have feelings about it, whether or not you think something will make you happy. That's the Humean view, and Garver seems to buy into this and say, well, that means that Kant's whole theory that morality is like this, Kant's theory suggests that morality is like math, that you can work out what the right thing to do is by running this little mental exercise using your reason alone, and that will tell you what the right thing to do is. Don't lie, for example. But what Garver says is, well, again, in keeping with the title of the piece, that's all very well in theory, but it won't work in practice because reason will not motivate you to act. And Kant just says, that's bullshit. I mean, look at how we act. A man is aware with the utmost clarity that he ought to fulfill his duty completely unselfishly. He says, I look inside me and I find different motivations. Sure, I am motivated by pleasure in many respects, but I am also motivated to do my duty. And actually, I feel happiness in doing my duty, but the happiness that I feel in doing my duty is not what motivates me. This reminds me of a famous story about Abraham Lincoln. What Hobbes famously endorsed is a theory called psychological hedonistic egoism, which says that the only thing that motivates us to act is our own pursuit of our own happiness. Nothing else motivates us. And a lot of people buy into this, and Garver seems to be one of them, that the only reason we ever do anything is in order to make ourselves happy. Now, Kant rejects this entirely. He says, no, we are motivated by all sorts of things, including, very importantly, our sense of what is right. And we will do what is right even when it makes us miserable. And, of course, we should in a lot of cases. But not all cases. Sometimes doing what is right will make us happy. And that's fine, says Kant. It's just, it mustn't be us, that it will make us happy shouldn't be what motivates us. What motivates us, if we are to be moral, is that it is the right thing to do. And the story goes that Lincoln also believed psychological hedonistic egoism, and he was having an argument with a friend of his in a long journey in a horse-drawn carriage, and the friend was saying, no, that theory is wrong, and Lincoln was saying, no, it works in every instance. And then apparently while they were having this argument, so the story goes, Lincoln looks out of the window of the carriage and sees that it's raining heavily outside, and this has caused a mudslide in a field that they're passing, and it is drowning some piglets in the field. They're just getting buried in this mudslide, and they will probably suffocate. Lincoln insists that the carriage be stopped, leaps out, wades into the mud, and saves the piglets, and gets back in drenched to the skin. And of course, this is much more dangerous in those days, because if you caught, pneumonia, you were very likely to die. So he gets back in, and the friend, of course, who has stayed nice and warm and cozy in the carriage and hasn't tried to help, said, "You've just disproved your theory. You said that we are only ever motivated by our own happiness, but come on, you just did something altruistic, which clearly was not motivated by your own happiness." And Lincoln responded, "On the contrary, if I hadn't done that, I would have felt bad all day." So in other words, Lincoln is saying, my real motivation for doing that was not to feel bad. But this just means that psychological hedonistic egoism is an unfalsifiable theory. You can explain everything in terms of pursuing your own happiness. And if it's unfalsifiable, then it's not really a theory at all, which is a philosophy of science issue. What makes a scientific theory is whether or not it can be tested and proved false. Psychological hedonistic egoism cannot be proved false, and therefore is not a scientific theory. Anyway, Kant rejects that theory and says, no, we are motivated by our duty. It's just a fact. There's more in this section, but I want to get to the section against Hobbes. So this is from the point of view of an individual as a member of a political sphere, as a member of a civil state. Now, the question that is being asked, the question that Kant is responding to is actually the same question or the same challenge that Rousseau says he's taking on at the beginning of the social contract. That is, how to legitimize a political state, which, as Kant insists at great length in this section of the essay, being a member of a political state, a civil state, requires that one be coerced, that one be forced to do things. And in fact, we have rights of coercion against our fellow citizens, he insists. How can one make this consistent with the value of freedom? And Kant, of course, is very insistent on the value of freedom. In fact, that is what makes humans of incalculable worth. That is, what is wrong with utilitarianism is that utilitarianism says that each individual can be counted merely as a sort of container of happiness. And if my happiness is like 10 hedons, but it would cause 1,000,000 hedons if I'm killed, then my 10 hedons just get swamped by the 1,000,000 and I should be killed. Whereas what Kant says is the fact that each of us has this almost miraculous ability, this freedom of the will, it means that we have in essence infinite value, and we can never, one individual's worth can never be outweighed by any amount of good. And why is it that we have this worth? Because we have this capacity, this freedom of the will. Now, we don't always use it well, and in fact, Kant's theory tells us how we should use it to be moral agents. But the fact that we have it makes us of value. Okay, then why doesn't this idea of his lead to a commitment to anarchy, a rejection of all political ties? Because, as he makes clear, being in a civil state requires, in some sense, restrictions on your liberty, on you being forced to do things. And if you're forced to do things, why isn't that an infringement of this infinitely valuable capacity you have? Well, he's giving an answer to that in this section. So Rousseau also thought he could come up with an answer to that. He says that yes, we are all naturally free, and we have, of course, for Rousseau's theory, we have this freedom in the state of nature that he describes in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. But, says Rousseau, we actually have a better kind of freedom if we are part of a general will in a well-ordered society, in a society that follows the rules that I lay out in the social contract. Now, what this requires is apparently actual consent. That's why it is always necessary to return to a first convention section of the social contract, and also requires us to be active participants in the legislature, and we cannot ever delegate that. That aspect of Rousseau's theory Kant rejects. And this is where he commits himself to a hypothetical contract. So when he talks about the original contract on pages 814 and 815, he makes it the most important phrase in this entire essay is right near the bottom of the first column on page 815. It is in fact merely an idea of reason, which nonetheless has undoubted practical reality. So what the contract is doing is it is a test of legitimacy for a state. When is a state legitimate? It's when, well, as he goes on to say, let's read that passage because it's probably the most important passage. So last two lines on the first column, bottom of the first column of page 815. It is in fact merely an idea of reason which nonetheless has undoubted practical reality. For it can oblige every legislator to frame his laws in such a way that they could have been produced by the united will of a whole nation. Remember, in Rousseau, the legislature was the general will. It literally had to be everybody contributing. This was actual legislation by the whole of the citizenry. But for Kant, you can have an individual legislator, possibly, but if that legislator wants to know what is a legitimate law, then it is the one that everybody could have agreed on. Now, notice that actually, in some respects, this is a sterner test than Rousseau, because Rousseau allows that it should be by majority vote. When what Rousseau says is that the forming of the legislature, that is the body politic, the citizenry as a whole, that requires unanimity. You are not a member of the citizenry unless you've consented. So in that respect, he agrees with Locke that you must give sort of joining consent. That requires, so everyone must have given their consent to be part of the citizenry. But once you are part of the citizenry, you can lose out in your vote. And in fact, almost half the people can lose out in their vote because everything is done by majority rule. And that's notoriously where he says, if you lose out, if you're one of the minority, then you can be forced to be free. Because being free, being in a society, means being governed by the will of the people as a whole. That's what it is to be free. And this can mean that you not getting what you voted for. So the democratic voters, those who voted for Bernie, are going to be forced to be free in accepting Biden. Now, this, of course, led to a lot of criticisms of Rousseau because that sounds very dubious. Whereas Kant is saying, no, there's not majority rule in this case. He's saying it can oblige every legislator to frame his laws in such a way that they could have been produced by the united will of a whole nation, and to regard each subject, insofar as he can claim citizenship, as if he had consented within the general will. This is the test of rightfulness of every public law. For if the law is such that a whole people could not possibly agree to it, and he gives an example of something that they could not possibly agree to. For example, if it is stated that a certain class of subjects must be privileged as a hereditary ruling class, it is unjust. So Kant has right then and there ruled out hereditary rulership, like the idea of a royal family or something like that. That is ruled out by his social contract, because it is not something that they could have all agreed to. Why couldn't they have all agreed to it? Because it would mean that they could very possibly not be a member of the ruling class. Thus, if a people under some existing legislation were asked to make a judgment which in all probability would prejudice its inhabitants, what should it do? Well, yes. So Kant says that this standard will rule out certain things like hereditary ruling class, but it will not rule out a lot of things that we might say, but wait a minute, there are all kinds of laws that might work against you. So, for example, laws that imprison people for breaking the law. What if you break the law? You're going to be imprisoned. Why would you vote for that? This is where Kant appears to drift from a hypothetical contract. So a hypothetical contract is a contract not of actual people, but it's where we say, well, what could people have agreed to? So in other words, is the society that we live under legitimate? Well, if we had an actual consent theory of legitimacy, as Hume pointed out with his history, then there's no way any state is legitimate, because the origins of all states are in, force and invasion and all things like that. And Kant says, you're right. Actual historical consent is not going to work. And he agrees with Hume that having a state is too valuable for all of them to be ruled out by fiat. Yes, so the other respect in which Kant appears to agree with Hobbes is that a stateless existence in a state of nature would be horrific. So he doesn't have the rosy view of the state of nature that we have in the first stages of of Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality, or even of a Lockean state of nature where you can gain property and where things go on pretty well, except if it weren't for some jerks starting problems. It's more like Hobbesian war of all against all. So we've got to have a state, and therefore we don't want it to be the case that it can be undermined by some fact of history. So the hypothetical contract says it's not that anybody's actually done this, it's could they agree to it. Now, the problem with the hypothetical contract is, well, people are stupid. They could have agreed to anything, right? So if you just say, what could they have agreed to? Then the next question is, who's the they? Are we talking about our actual citizens? Do we have to go around and ask a poll and say, could you have agreed to this? I know you didn't, but could you have agreed to this? Is that what you mean? And then, of course, a hypothetical contract would produce different results depending on different citizenry, because the French could have agreed to force people to eat baguettes or something, whereas the Americans would never agree to that. So a hypothetical contract in France could have resulted in forced baguette eating, whereas a hypothetical contract in USA couldn't. Is that what you mean by the hypothetical contract? And it doesn't seem to be, because what he seems to suggest is it's not just a hypothetical contract of actual stupid people. So, yes, an actual contract of actual stupid people would be what they actually agreed to. A hypothetical contract of those stupid people would be what could they have agreed to. And if they're stupid enough, it could be anything. What he wants to say is it's more like an ideal contract. So it's not just what they could have agreed to. That's the hypothetical one. It's what they should have agreed to. So the true standard of legitimacy is according to what reasonable people would agree to. So it's not the actual stupid people, what they would agree to. It's what reasonable people would agree to. And of course, then you can insist on unanimity, because reasonable people, who don't really exist, can reach unanimity because they're all motivated by the same principles and they take things seriously. That's supposed to, so in other words, it's supposed to be more like a jury. It's an ideal jury, because an ideal jury, you're supposed to reach consensus. You're not just supposed to say, I think he's guilty, I don't want to give my reasons, I don't have to give my reason, I'm just going to say he's guilty, that's my vote, and you can't change my mind. That's unreasonable. Reasonable is you're supposed to be prepared to be brought round, and everybody's supposed to agree on the same facts, and everybody's supposed to agree on the same rules and things like that. So, Kant suggests that the standard of legitimacy in a civil society is given by this hypothetical and also ideal social contract. Now, the point of this section is to demonstrate that this theory can help in the design of a just society. So it tells you, and also it seems like his theory is less open-ended than an actual consent theory, because an actual consent theory might allow that people could, some group of people would agree to have an absolutist monarch. If they did agree, then that's okay. Some group of people might agree to have a direct democracy. If that's what they agree to, well, that's what applies to them. So an actual consent theory can't really prejudge what kind of government would be legitimate, because it depends on what people actually agree to. Which is why some people have interpreted the contract theorists we've already looked at, who stipulate that certain kinds of government are ruled out, as not being pure actual consent. They sneak in kind of hypothetical elements, like what would they agree to? And Hobbes, of course, is one of the main theorists that people say this about, because he does have a discussion of what it would be rational to agree to. Actually, so does Locke. So if you're talking about what it would be rational to agree to, then it sounds like you're bringing in hypothetical or even ideal contract elements, because if you were a pure actual contract theorist, then you can't prejudge what people actually would agree to. If you just say, my standard is whatever people agree to, so long as they agree to it, then it could be anything. Whereas what Kant is saying, no, my standard is what people should agree to. And then you can narrow the field a lot. And certainly Kant has ruled out hereditary monarchies, for example, or hereditary aristocracies. And he's insisted that there be the civil state, regarded purely as a lawful state, is based on the following a priori principles. This is on page 812. The freedom of every member of society as a human being, the equality of each with the others as a subject, and the independent of each member of the Commonwealth. So these we regard now, in our previous theorist, liberty and equality were supposed to be, in some sense, facts either of the law of nature or of just how humans are in a natural state. Whereas Kant is deriving them directly from the use of reason. So it's more like a Lockean law of nature kind of idea. But these are things that he says follows from, they're a priori. So they're certainly not facts that we discover from researching the way humans are. So that seems to be what Hobbes is doing. Hobbes says humans, in fact, in a state of nature, are equal in the sense that they all pose a risk to one another. I could kill you in your sleep even if I'm weaker than you. That seems to be an empirical fact that we learn about humans, that equality. Kant's equality is not like that at all. It's just something that is a truth of reason. And it's much more like what you have in the American Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's exactly the same as saying that they're a priori truths. These are truths that we just know from looking from a conception of humans as free agents. So these three things are features of human. These are facts of reasons that we can use in designing our government. And in a very important passage on the second column of page 812, Kant says that man's freedom as a human being rules out paternalistic government. Now, paternalistic government is a kind of government that utilitarians might be in favor of, because a paternalistic government says that your government should look after your interests perhaps better than you can yourself. So in other words, a paternalistic government might force you to get educated, might force you to get vaccinated, might force you to do all these kind of things for your own good. And you will actually lead a successful paternalistic government will mean that you are happier than if you'd been left to your own devices. Kant, as you might expect, is violently opposed to that. As he says, a government might be established on the principle of benevolence towards the people, like that of a father towards his children. Under such a paternal government, the subjects, as immature children who cannot distinguish what is truly useful or harmful to themselves, would be obliged to behave purely passively and rely on the judgment of the head of state as to how they ought to be happy. Such a government is the greatest conceivable despotism. Greatest conceivable, worse than a tyrant. That seems a bit weird. I.e., a constitution which suspends the entire freedom of its subjects, who thenceforth have no rights whatsoever. Again, if utilitarians would approve of it, you know that Kant would not be in favor of it, because they are not given the chance to behave as true human beings. They're being rounded up and treated. They're being treated like pets. So I love my pet, and I want my pet to live a long and happy life, but I don't think my pet should be in charge of making decisions for itself. Kant says even if they lead a happier life under such a government, it's still despotic and it's the worst system because it doesn't respect the inherent freedom. Now, your equality as a subject, so that's the freedom. The equality, he spends a bit of time saying what it isn't. So it isn't physical equality. It isn't even equality of wealth. Your equality is just equality before the law, and that applies to everybody. No one can lose its authority to coerce others and have rights towards them. So my equality towards you is that we both have rights against each other. I have the right that you be coerced by the law, and you have the same right against me. The only way you can lose this is through committing a crime. And nobody can voluntarily renounce this. You can't contract yourself into slavery. Public right in a commonwealth is simply a state. This is the second column on page 813. Is simply a state of affairs regulated by a real legislation which conforms to this principle and is backed up by power under which a whole people live as subjects in a lawful state. The third one is independence. And this is where he brings up the original contract. Remember, Rousseau, of course, was very much concerned with independence. Independence is the sort of link between liberty and equality. In this second column on page 814, he talks about what it takes to be a citizen, and that is regarded as part of the original contract. And here is where Kant starts sounding a little bit less liberal. He says that you must be an adult male, you must be your own master, presumably that means not a child, and have some property. Now, he does say that property includes skill, trades, fine art, or science. So he's not just saying rich landowners get to be part of the legislature or get to be part of the original contract. But in a note number 8, where you can see on page 824, he says people who do not count as having property include the domestic servant, the shop assistant, the laborer, or even the barber. So the barber doesn't have a skill that he can sell, apparently, according to Kant. So these kind of people would be ruled out, including women as well. So Kant is lamentably sexist about many things. It's sad that a lot of the great modern philosophers have mental blind spots. There's actually a thriving literature on how racist Kant was as well. But what Kantians say is that that's just prejudices he happened to have that actually were inconsistent with his theory, if you interpret it correctly. And actually his theory is perfectly liberal and very the best theory you could have to justify treating people equally and for condemning racism. So that's an ongoing argument about Kant and Hume, actually. Okay, so the other main discussion in this section is about the right to rebellion, and he says that's mainly discussed on page 816 and 817, where he argues that no, it is against the whole point of a civil society to have a right to rebellion, and he brings up the old issue of who is to judge between the rulers and the people. There is nobody above them that you can appeal to. So, and if you appointed someone, then he actually makes a point like Hobbes, that if you appoint another body to judge between the ruler and the people, then you have divided powers, and you, in a sense, have two rulers. And we know for Hobbes that was the worst possible thing because it undermines stability. So Kant certainly seems to agree with the Hobbesian argument against divided government and argues that there is no right of rebellion. Well, that sounds like he's in favor of kind of absolutist government. No, because although there is no right to rebel, you do have inalienable rights that the ruler cannot violate. Makes you wonder, though, well, if they do violate them, what's my recourse? I can't rebel. But the discussion of the rights that you do have, so this is the sense in which he disagrees with Hobbes. He agrees, or takes himself to be agreeing, in that you can't divide power and you can't have a right of rebellion. But he disagrees by saying that you do have inalienable rights, and this is on page 818, and the freedom of the pen is the example. Freedom of the pen is the only safeguard of the rights of the people. So it must not transcend the bounds of respect and devotion towards the existing constitution. That sounds like a bit of a restriction, which should itself create a liberal attitude of mind amongst the subjects. What he's saying, I think what he's saying here is, we're talking about within a just society. So in a just society, we have principles of freedom of the press anyway. So if I'm saying your press should not transcend the bounds of respect and devotion towards the existing constitution, you shouldn't use your soapbox, as, for example, someone like Tucker Carlson might be accused of doing, to rail against the institutions of our liberal system. You shouldn't rail against the freedom of the press, or you shouldn't rail for a theocratic government. Kant is very much opposed to a theocratic government because that would be to basically have one idea of what is good imposed on everybody. That would be like a paternalistic government. Yeah, in fact, he discusses that in the second column on page 18. So the general principle, bottom of the first column of page 818, according to which people may judge negatively what it believes was not decreed in goodwill by the supreme legislation, can be summed up as follows. Wherever people cannot impose upon itself, cannot be imposed upon it by a legislator either. This is the contract. If you wouldn't have chosen it for yourself, it cannot be imposed by the legislator. For example, if we wish to discover whether the law which declares permanently valid an ecclesiastical constitution, so a religious state, we must first ask whether a people is authorized to make a law for itself whereby certain accepted doctrines and outward forms of religion are declared permanent, and whether the people may thus prevent its own descendants from making further progress. No, you can't impose your way of, your idea of what is right on other free agents in perpetuity. So therefore you cannot have a religious state. So Kant is in many respects the forerunner of a liberal, tolerant state like the United States. Well, not the forerunner because the United States existed, but the very much in keeping with the modern ideal, at least until we into this new era of strongmen. The final section. Let me just read this passage on 818. In every commonwealth there must be obedience to generally valid coercive laws within the mechanism of the political constitution. There must also be a spirit of freedom. So you've got to balance these two things. That's always the puzzle in social contract theories. For in all matters concerning universal human duties, each individual requires to be convinced by reason that the coercion which prevails is lawful. Otherwise he would be in contradiction with himself. Obedience without the spirit of freedom is the effective cause of all secret societies, which must be bad, I guess. The last section, also, so remember, all three of these sections are sort of in some respects a response to the criticism, oh, your ideas are all very well in theory, Kant, but they have no practical application. So the first section was in the moral sphere, and it was saying your particular theory of morality, Kant, won't actually motivate people to act because they're motivated by pursuit of their own happiness, and he argued against that. Second section is, what does your theory have to say about political matters? How can we respect freedom in the way that you can't say is important, and at the same time have a political state? Well, there you go. He answered it by use of this hypothetical contract. The third one is, it's sort of a response to pessimism. Moses Mendelssohn was a great Jewish philosopher who wrote pessimistically about the human race. Boy, if he'd only known what was coming in the 20th century, how much more pessimistic he could have been. But he basically said we never really make any progress. And Kant says, well, insofar as I believe on that human beings are capable of applying reason and developing, and humanity is capable of developing, as part of my theory, I have to respond to this idea of pessimism. And his response concerns this, what he takes. He predicts that we will move towards a system that will prevent wars, because it is the wars that are primarily the cause of this pessimism that Mendelssohn exhibits. So this response to the pessimism, he has to respond to it because his theory views humanity so positively as this, as having infinite worth. How can one look at humans in general and think of them positively, says Mendelssohn. And Kant says, well, that's because of the wars we get into. And actually, just as social contract theorists from Hobbes onwards have said humans solve the problem of the state of nature by forming political institutions, so, says Kant, humans are going to take this one step further and solve the problems of wars between nations by instituting a cosmopolitan interstate system. So sort of the next step up, something like the United Nations or the League of Nations. And everybody made fun of Kant, but again, the United Nations, we've had the most peaceful stretch, the post-World War II stretch when the United Nations came into effect has been the most peaceful stretch, and there has never been, I believe, I saw this written recently and I trust what I read, there has never been a war between two democracies. Now, of course, Germany was a democracy when Hitler came to power, but it ceased to be a democracy, I think, when Hitler was in power. But that's the argument, and of course that seems to be proving Kant right in that respect. Of course, we're moving away from that, and the United Nations and the European Union and things like that are under great stress at present, which might cause Mendelssohn to say, see what I meant about one step forward, two steps back. But it's an argument for basically an intergovernmental system like the United Nations. All right, that's Kant. So the major lesson to take out of this is that Kant reinterprets the social contract as a hypothetical contract, and also, although he doesn't say so, it appears also to be an ideal contract, not just what people could have agreed to, the hypothetical part, but also what people should have agreed to. So in other words, what they would have agreed to had they been reasonable individuals. And as we shall see, I believe, this idea of the social contract was greatly expanded on by the greatest Anglo-American political philosopher of the second half of the 20th century, John Rawls, in his monumental work, Theory of Justice. It is unapologetically Kantian, and he takes the idea of the hypothetical contract and expands it enormously. There you go. That's Kant.